Hi, I'm Alfonso Muchacho and I just stole this car to help you make better music. Of course I didn't steal that car, I only came here to steal your hearts. But whilst the good Lord Muchacho taketh away, he also giveth, and my gift to you today via the magic of the Audiotent YouTube channel is some wisdom on how to make some music on cheap and terrible speakers. Now, I don't have cheap speakers, but I did. And you might because you're broke, or you may have just started out and you don't want that huge financial commitment, or you live in an apartment with paper-thin walls. All of these things can cause problems for you, especially when you're trying to get your levels right. I always struggled with trying to get my bass levels right for years, and due to poor monitoring, I only really solved it when I upgraded my monitors. There are ways to mitigate any huge embarrassing errors though without spending a lot of money, and that's what I'm going to discuss here. On smaller speakers or headphones, people have a tendency to overemphasize the bass frequencies. The reason for this is obvious on smaller speakers, as you simply can't expect to hear the sub-frequencies on tiny speakers, so you'll tend to push your levels too high in order to hear the bass line. On headphones, you might push the bass too loud because you can only hear the sounds as opposed to feeling them when you're in front of large monitors. The other problem you'll also run into on headphones is a lack of phantom center. This is the way your brain perceives the sound coming from directly in front of you when you're facing a set of stereo speakers. As yet, I haven't seen a solution to this that's possible in headphones. But not to worry, there are some things we can do. And to demonstrate, I have of course made a short 45-second track. Let's quickly go through the parts so you can understand what I've done. First up, the bass line is called Caverns and it's from the Division pack. The pad sound is from the Scope pack and it's called Ghosts. Spooky. The main melody is from the Division pack as well. And all of the percussion is taken straight from the Gradient sample pack, and together it all sounds like this. Okay, so the whole track goes a little something like this. So the reason I was sat in the car earlier is because it's one of the oldest tricks in the book when you're trying to check your mix. The idea being to check your mix on as many different sets of speakers as possible. But in my humble opinion, you should only be doing this on speakers that you know really well. The reason being is you need to have a reference in your mind as to what a well-produced track sounds like on that system. There's very little use in my mind in checking your mix on a sound system that you don't know very well. You won't know what to expect, and if your high end is coming through too loud, how will you know if it's the track that's off or if it's just the character of that system? The idea with using the car is you probably listen to a lot of music in it anyway, so you should in theory have a decent idea of what to expect from that system. Another safe bet is listening through your laptop or smartphone, as you're going to get a familiar sound, and probably one that's without a lot of bass. This can be a blessing and a curse. In theory, it should allow you to pick out anything particularly irritating in the mid to high ranges, but it can also highlight a lack of bass. This is obviously because the device is incapable of reproducing something really low. But just because your bass line isn't coming through thick and heavy from your iPhone doesn't mean you should rethink your mix and add in a bass line that sits further up in the spectrum so that it can be heard from a tiny speaker. This might be a good idea if you're making pop music and your intended audience might be listening on some such device. But remember, we're making dance floor friendly tracks here, designed to be heard in clubs, not on small speakers. If your track has a loud sub-bass, don't worry about that coming through on a phone. You probably shouldn't be listening to techno on something that small anyway. So let's say you have monitors that are pretty terrible and you do a lot of mixing on headphones. How can you check your levels are in the right ballpark? Well, luckily we have meters that can help with that. Now, people always say mix with your ears, not with your eyes. And this is true, but when you can't trust your ears, meters are a great way to visualize what's going on. My favorite tool is the Ozone EQ, as I really like the ability to store snapshots. You'll notice I'm using a particularly vintage version of Ozone. This is because I prefer the look over the newer version, which I foolishly bought and never used. So the principle works with any frequency analyzer, but essentially what you're looking at here is a snapshot of all the frequency info of a track, averaged out over 10 seconds of the busiest part of that track. If we play my track now, we'll be able to see how mine measures up. Okay, immediately you should be able to hear that I've done a pretty good job at getting my track to sound well balanced. You'll notice that most of the tracks you listen to follow this same sort of shape. You don't have to match it exactly, but it's a great target to aim for. If I ran the same measurement over 10 tracks I like, I'm 100% sure they'd all look fairly similar. One thing to look out for, and this drives mastering engineers crazy, is this snapshot here. You'll notice a steep drop off in the highest frequencies. The reason for this is I've measured an MP3. MP3s are a lossy codec, meaning they compress the audio to save space. And what you tend to lose is a lot of the high end as demonstrated here. So when people say they can't hear the difference between a WAV file and MP3, you can. It's all up here. You just need to know what you're listening out for. So of course the danger you have is you analyze your favorite track, but it's an MP3 and you think, hey, they cut off a lot of the info in the high end. I should do too. So then you run a low pass filter over your entire mix to match your reference. Please do not do this. I see it all the time in masters. You're losing all of the air from the top of your track, and when it's uploaded to SoundCloud or Spotify, you'll lose it all anyway. Please don't make this mistake. You might see a slight taper in some tracks, particularly those that are printed to tape, but you shouldn't be filtering off your high end to make your track sound like an MP3. As I mentioned earlier, I like to have my analyzer set to average out over 10 seconds. This gives me a balance between kind of chasing a moving target and having changes in the track not affect the spectrum too much. I wouldn't recommend setting your average to infinite, as you don't want to average your entire track, including the intro and breakdowns. Take a busy section and aim for that. A free alternative to Ozone is Span, which is just as capable. It can be set to custom timings and doesn't cost a penny. There is a danger here though, not with Span, but with any analyzer, and that's to do with changes in your mix not being reflected as dramatically in the analyzer. Here I'll adjust the baseline up by 3 dB, which is quite a dramatic jump, as you will definitely be able to hear it. Keep an eye on the analyzers and watch for how this is reflected. Okay, so you should be able to see a change, but it's really not that noticeable. Let's turn down by 6 dB, so I'm making the bassline half as loud, and watch out for the change there. So this is in part due to the kick taking up a sizable chunk of the bass frequencies, but it's also because your ears are simply more useful than any analyzer. This goes back to listen with your ears and not with your eyes. Analyzers are tools that can be useful for getting in the right ballpark, but they shouldn't replace actual critical listening, including the use of reference tracks. One area where they really do come into their own is in the stereo field. Let's flip the Ozone EQ to mid-side and you'll immediately see two lines dancing around, one for the center and one for the sides. I'll be honest, I've been making music for so long now that my tracks just normally match the standard frequency curve. But using a mid-side mode sometimes shows me if I'm lacking something, particularly in the sides and usually in the low end. A quick and easy way to rectify this is of course to use a stereo EQ just to give the sides a bit of a boost. There's nothing wrong with this if you're aiming for just a couple of dB. Anything more drastic and you'll probably have to go into your track to sort things out properly. There are literally thousands of tools to help you visualize the stereo field. Another one that I own is Paz from Waves. Isotope's Insight is also very good at this. For my tastes, Ableton doesn't really have anything great for this. You can enlarge the EQ8 and use that in mid-side mode and it'll do a job though. So, 2 quick tips before I go. If you're looking at your low end and it seems to reach on forever, you probably have a lot of sub bass in your track. My preference is to cut the bass itself rather than the whole track because you will alter the kick in ways that you might not like. Bear in mind, any mastering engineer that knows what they're doing will tidy up small errors in the super sub areas, but if your curve looks like it's going to keep going and going and going, try putting a 35Hz brick wall cut on your bass and see if that helps. And finally, to completely contradict what I said earlier about the high end, you will want a sort of roll-off here. Not a steep curve that you get from an MP3, but a more gentle slope. In my experience, if you don't have this sort of curve, you'll end up with a lot of harshness from your cymbals and shakers, particularly they're the big offenders here. A smooth EQ over the top should just tame these harsh noises and stop your tracks sounding piercing. Alternatively, I like to occasionally use a tape emulation across my hats to give them a subtle roll-off. Okay, that's it. I hope you found some of that useful. You don't need to blindly follow any curves or any of the things I've outlined here, but if you find you run into a lot of problems when your tracks are played in a club, using meters like this can help diagnose those problem areas. Have a splendid day.